Udon, you wanna go to work? Go to work. Welcome back, everyone. Today we're gonna be making a pet hoodie, and you can make this for both cats and dogs. It's pretty hard to find the perfect fitting hoodie in stores, so it's best just to make your own. The pattern comes in multiple sizes, and it can be easily adjusted to fit your pet's measurements. Also, a fun thing to do is you can pair this with our hoodie pattern, and you can make matching outfits for you and your pet. I'll have a link for that in the description below. But other than that, let's get started. Getting service supplies, you're going to want to grab up to 1.25 yards of sweatshirt fleece, and this is depending on the size you're making. And also make sure your fleece is nice and stretchy. 1/4 yard of ribbing, also known as rib knit fabric. This will be used for the cuffs and waistband. 1 yard of cord, and this is optional. If you decide to add hoodie pulls, 1 to 2 cord stops depending on the style, and also 2 eyelets. In the size eyelets we're using are 5/16. 1 button snap, and you can use plastic or metal. And lastly, your pattern. The pattern is available at properfitclothing.com, and the link will be provided in the description below. Once you printed the pattern, it's best to cut the top edge and the side edge of all the pages. This will allow you to overlap the pattern from left to right in alphanumerical order. Once you have the pages all lined up, tape it together and cut out the size that works best for your pet. And the size chart provides measurements to help give you a better idea of what size to use for your pet. And if you need to add measurements or fine-tune the measurements, it's super easy. All you need to do is extend the fold line or the bottom edge line of the back panel. And if you extend the bottom edge line, make sure you do the same thing for the chest panel so that way the side seams line up. And if you're confused, by extending the fold line on the back panel, you're increasing the girth, and the bottom edge, you're increasing the length. And after cutting, you should end up with 2 sleeve panels, 2 pocket panels that are cut on the fold, 4 hood panels, 1 chest panel cut on the fold, 1 back panel cut on the fold, 2 sleeve cuff panels cut on the fold out of your ribbing, and lastly 1 waistband panel cut on the fold out of your ribbing. And before we get started, for this project we're going to be using a serger. Sergers are great for stretchy knit fabrics. They're going to allow the fabric to stretch and the thread not to break. They also cut and clean up the edges as you're sewing. I highly recommend using a serger for this project, but if you don't have one, it's totally fine. I'm going to show you another method for sewing stretchy knit on your domestic sewing machine. Switch your machine to a zigzag stitch with the higher width and stitch length, and by doing this, it will allow the thread to stretch with the fabric. And either method works great. I just don't want you to feel left out if you don't have a serger. Moving on to construction, grab your hood panel and place the right sides together, and we're going to sew along the back arched edge. This pattern calls for a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and it's included in the pattern. Flip the right side out on one of your hood panel sections. Place it on the inside of your other section with right sides together. Line up the top and bottom edges and sew along the top edge. And you mainly want to make sure that both of the top middle seams are lined up. Once the stitch is complete, flip the right side out. The next step, we're going to be adding the eyelets, and this is totally optional if you're going to be adding the cord cinch. If not, you can skip ahead. Line the eyelet up about 2.5 to 3 inches from the bottom and 1 inch from the opening edge. We're going to be using just a standard hammer die to install it, so go ahead and make your marks with chalk, cut your holes, place your eyelets, flip it around to the wrong side, place your back on, and hammer into position. And try to line them up as best as possible. And from here, we're going to add our cord path by stitching on the outside of the eyelet all the way around, and it's best to pin the fabric down so that way it's not moving around as you're sewing. It'll help keep those layers lined up and look cleaner in the end. Keep the same distance from the edge all the way around, and since we're sewing through a few layers of fabric, it's okay to use a straight stitch. Line up the center seams on the bottom edge, and we're going to serge that bottom edge so that way it's easier to install later on in the video. And if you're not using a serger, just make sure you zigzag stitch as close as you can to the edge. Grab both of your pocket panels, place the right sides together, and we're going to sew all of the edges except for the top. We're leaving the top open so that way we can flip the right sides out after sewing. And when you have all those edges sewn, go ahead and flip the right sides out and add a stitch to that top edge, securing both the layers together. Or zigzag stitch directly on that edge if you don't have a serger. Grab your back panel, and we're going to place that pocket in the center about 3 inches from the bottom. Or you can place it wherever it looks best to you. Flip the pocket directly up from where you placed it and pin it down. We're going to straight stitch directly above where you serged or zigzag stitched. Make sure you do a nice tack stitch at the beginning and end of your stitch. Flip the pocket back to the original position and pin it down. Make sure the back panel is not bunchy and laying flat, and we're going to sew the top edge, the side edges, and the bottom edge. We're going to be using a presser foot that has an edge guide on it. This will help you get an even stitch around those edges. And this will be a straight stitch. I recommend just taking your time, going slow, so that way all those top stitches come out even from the edge and straight. And this is one of those steps that if the stitches come out sloppy and crooked, it's going to affect the entire look of your sweatshirt. Finding a thread that matches your fabric is really helpful to hide any of those blemishes. I should have mentioned before, you can top stitch the openings, but this is done before you attach it to the back panel. Grab both of your sleeve panels and make sure you remember which side is which. You can mark it if you want, and we're going to line the back panel edge up with the back panel opening and flip the sleeve panel down so the right sides are together. Do this for both panels and stitch along that edge. Since both of the panels are kind of curved at this point, it's helpful to stretch it as you sew. This will help give you a straighter edge when running it through the machine. From here, we're going to add a top stitch to both of those edges, so flip the seam allowance towards the back panel and stitch directly over it. This will be done with a straight stitch and our edge guide. Grab your back panel, and what we're going to do is place it flat with the right sides together, and we're going to line it up on the opposite side of that sleeve panel. Sew it the same way by stretching it a little bit as you sew. And before we attach it to the other side, add a top stitch. In this one, the seam allowance will point towards the chest panel. And lastly, take the other side of the chest panel and line it up with the opposite sleeve. Sew it together using the same technique, and just like before, add a top stitch to that seam with the seam allowance pointing towards the chest panel. Lay your panels flat and flip the right sides together. We're going to sew the side seams, so line up the armpit seam and the bottom edge. And when you have them lined up, go ahead and stitch from the sleeve opening to the bottom edge. Repeat this process for the other side seam. The key is to keep both of those armpit seams lined up. And if you want, you can add a top stitch to those edges, but it's not completely necessary. Flip it inside out and mark the neckline centers on both chest and back panel. Grab your hood panel and place it inside the opening. Line up the back center with the center seam on the hood. Pin it into position and line up the front of the hood with the center of the chest panel. And we're going to sew all the way around that edge. I like to start on the chest panel so that way the center of the hood stays square as I'm sewing. And this just helps me guarantee that the hood will be perfectly aligned. And when your hood is attached, we're going to add a top stitch to the edge by folding the seam allowance towards the body panel. And this is another top stitch you just want to take your time. You're sewing through a lot of material, so take it slow and make sure it's not bunching. And the thing is with these top stitches, you can skip them if you want, if you don't want that look, but overall it adds a little bit extra strength and a professional look. When completed the top stitch, flip the right side out and give your hoodie a once over look. Make sure all the seams are looking good and that there's no bunching. Grab your sleeve cuff panels and your waistband panel. Place the right sides together and sew just the shorter edge. I found a straight stitch works best with the ribbing, and do this for all the panels. Sew as close as you can to the outer edge and keep this consistent throughout all the panels. With the right sides together, fold it in half so that way the wrong sides are touching and it rounds off the bottom. Do the same for both the cuff panels. Take the waistband panel with the round side pointed up and place it on the bottom edge of your body panel. When you have the edges lined up, you're going to sew all the way around, and we're going to go ahead and do the same thing for the cuff panels. Round side up and place them on the inside of your sleeve openings. And as you're sewing, just make sure you're sewing through all the layers. Sometimes the ribbing will separate, so keep an eye on that as you're sewing. But if it does separate as you're sewing and you don't notice it, it's totally fine. You can always go back and re-sew it. And again, repeat this process for both of the sleeve cuff panels. The sleeve openings can be a little bit tight, so just take your time and go slow and work the fabric around into the machine. Do a quick check after sewing, and then go ahead and flip the right sides out. Flip it around so the back panel is facing up, and we're going to add a top stitch to the waistband and the cuffs. We're top stitching on the sweatshirt fleece, so flip the seam allowance towards the body. And for the waistband, it's a very stretchy area, so once you get halfway, stop the stitch and start a new one, so that way you don't have a full stitch going all the way around that can snap very easily. I found splitting this top stitch up really prevents the thread from snapping. And do the same thing for the sleeve cuff panels. And for this one, I don't separate the stitch, I just go all the way through in one go. I found that this area on a dog hoodie doesn't get that much stretch. Overall, it just adds a really nice professional look to your hoodie. If you chose to add a cinch cord, grab your cord and grab a pin, and we're going to pin it to the end of the cord and thread it through our eyelets. If you have a better technique for doing this, definitely leave it in the comments below. I just always do this way because it's super easy. You can just kind of work the cord around and pull it out the other side and you're good to go. Trim the cord to your preferred length and light the ends if you're using parachute cord. This will prevent fraying. Slide on your cord stopper or stoppers if you're using two. And you can always trim up more after the fact. It's probably best to have less so your pet doesn't get tangled in it. or tie it up, whatever works best for you. Flip the hoodie around so the back panel is facing up, and we're going to fold the hood back so we can get the placement for our snap button. I'm using a metal snap button. It's probably best to use a plastic so it doesn't rip the fabric, but go ahead and make your markings, place your button in the hole, and press it into position. I'm using a die press. You can also use hand presses or whatever method you choose. Give it a test by snapping the button into position, and this is going to hold that hood back so it's not flopping all in your pet's face. But other than that, your pet hoodie is complete. And thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. It means so much to me. It's crazy how we're almost at 100,000 subscribers. I'm going to try to plan something special for when we hit that mark. If you have any suggestions, definitely send them my way. Same with designs or things you want to see me make. Just send them over or comment them below and I'll try to make it happen. But I'm going to keep the patterns and videos coming, so stay safe and I'll see you next time.